Hi everyone, I'm Heath Hightower, co-host of Process Recordings. Before we get started with today's show, I want to just give you a quick reminder. While Lisa and I hope you find our show useful, we also want you to know that it's not a substitute for therapy. If you do need a therapist, however, we do recommend that you check out the psychologytoday.com website. Also, if you need immediate support, contact 988, which is the 3-digit number to contact the National Crisis Hotline and Suicide number. Thanks for listening and watching, and enjoy the show. Hi everybody, I'm Heath Hightower.
And I'm Lisa Wessan.
And welcome to Process Recordings, the show where we have real talk about real human experiences, as well as real strategies and techniques to help you learn better, live better, work better, and love better. How are you today, Lisa?
I'm actually better than ever, thanks.
Yeah? So what are we doing today? What are we talking about?
Well, we are planning to talk about grief.
Grief.
Part one is going to be the explanation of what it is and the kind of literature review of definitions. And part two is going to be our interventions and ways we help our people out and our family, loved ones, clients, whatever, get through it.
Yeah.
Techniques.
Yeah, that's right. And in addition to building off of those definitions, we're also going to spend some time talking about the myths about grief, as well as some of the realities of grief.
Yes.
And we also wanted to make sure that we spent some time talking about kinds of grief that people experience quite commonly, but we don't really talk about those kinds of griefs very often. So we're going to end the episode with a conversation about those griefs.
Yeah. The highlight reel, disenfranchised grief, ambiguous loss.
Yeah, that's right.
There's a whole bunch of them that are very difficult, and we're going to get to them.
Yeah. So why don't we just start off by letting people know what grief is and how it might be different from some other experiences.
Professor Heath, I defer to you.
Wow, deferring to me.
To start us off.
Oh, well, of course, exactly.
I'm always a student, and I'm also a teacher. But
well, we're all students and
right,
teachers. So,
absolutely.
So I'm going to kick this off by giving just my definition of grief, because there's plenty of definitions in textbooks, and you could certainly look it up in the dictionary. I think about grief as a whole person response to a real or perceived loss. That could be anything from moving, it could be divorce, it could also be happy things. Sometimes getting married can cause grief. Having a child can cause grief. So really, grief is any response or any reaction to a real or perceived loss.
Yeah, I like that, because that includes transitions. And even like when you move, I remember in graduate school, like the top 5 stresses were like birth, death, relocation, getting married.
Yeah.
And these
retirement,
all these things, like some of them are happy ones.
Yeah.
But the transitioning is often brutal.
Yeah.
And the first year of marriage is known. I mean, in the Jewish tradition, it's called the Yom Rishon, and they know it's brutal. It's very difficult to get through it because there's so many changes. And learning to live with a new person is not easy. Even when you love them, even when you're crazy about them, it's not easy.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we certainly see in our own personal lives with friends, loved ones, and ourselves, but also with our clients, is that there's a difference between being depressed and experiencing grief, right?
Well, that's the important distinction.
Yes.
We get many people coming to our practices who think they're depressed, but they have like frozen grief, unexpressed grief, and sometimes rage. And that's the real thing, not the depression. And the depression is just kind of a symptom of it.
Right, right. And so when I think about the distinction between depression and grief, here are some of the common distinctions that I see. So one of those distinctions is that when people are depressed, they have a mood where they can't anticipate happiness or pleasure at all. Whereas in grief, there is this overwhelming sense of emptiness and loss that really predominates. I think another really important difference is that in depression, the feelings of sadness, or what we call dysphoria, are really generalized, meaning that you feel that way whether you're sitting in bed or in front of the television or at work. You kind of feel it everywhere. Whereas oftentimes the depressed mood that people are experiencing grief are really specific to when they're thinking about the person, pet, place, or thing that they've lost.
Right. And to that, that's great to say it that way. And I would to add to that is that my experience, people in grief are living in the past. They're going through the memories and they're wondering, especially if it was the loss of a child, what could have I done better? Maybe I should have done this. They live in, they shoulda, woulda, coulda. They're beating themselves up sometimes.
Yeah.
And I know when my sister recently went through her battle with cancer, I mean, there was always a constant question, like, what else can we do for her? Like, what else can you? And when now she passed away last November 8th. And it's like, I still wonder sometimes, like, what else could I have done? Like, I had to let go of that. Lisa, it's not rational. But you wonder, you know, and it's you're stuck in the past. The grief is very much past focused.
Right.
You know?
Right. The other thing that also typically differentiates people who are experiencing grief versus depression is that people who are grieving, their self-esteem is actually usually intact still, whereas people who are experiencing depression, they usually feel worthless. They feel that they're no good. And I would say the final thing that I see certainly is that both categories of people who are experiencing depression as well as people who are experiencing grief may want to die, but they usually want to die for two very different reasons. So the griever usually wants to die as a way to reunify or reconnect with the person, place, pet, or thing that they've lost, whereas oftentimes the reason why people who are feeling depressed want to die is that they don't feel worthy of living. They feel like it's the only way to escape, if you will. So those are some of the, I think, important distinctions between depression and grief.
Yes, those are good. I like that.
Yeah.
And also when people are depressed, well, people with grief and depression also typically have low energy. It makes you exhausted, you know. But people who are depressed also are, you know, also ashamed.
Yeah.
I don't know. People with grief don't have maybe as much shame.
Yeah.
You know? So there's more shame involved with depression, I think.
Yeah. And I would say, again, just based on my experience, it would depend on maybe what the nature of the death. So for instance, when I think about the work that I do with suicide loss survivors, oftentimes there can be a great deal of shame about that because of the stigma and taboo around suicide. The other thing that I would also say that's a little bit different about suicide loss is that the people who have survived that loss spend a great deal of time really trying to make sense of that death. Why did that happen? How could that have happened? What you said a little bit earlier, what, if anything, could I have done? What did I miss? And that's a really normal part of that healing process.
Yeah. That's one of the worst losses, I think, when a child or a loved one commits suicide. It's that grief. We've talked about it in our pre-show meeting.
Yeah.
It's hard to recover from it.
Yeah. A death by suicide is definitely a unique experience. And so I think is worth differentiating from some of the other kinds of griefs that people experience.
Very much.
Based on your experiences, we talked about people's sadness. We talked about people's self-esteem. What are some other characteristics or qualities of grief that people might be experiencing that they might label something as being something different from your experience?
Right. So when I think of my personal experience with my practice and also my personal life, very often the appetite gets affected. They're either not eating or they're eating too much. You know, so the food medication, food medicators are eating more. They may turn to substances, alcohol, drugs, weed, whatever. And the need for quiet to being able to grieve, I always tell people that you have to give yourself permission to do the grief work. Like, there's no problem. If you don't feel like going out with your friends one night, it's okay. Take a night off, know, because people try to come around and get you out of the house and cheer you up. And to give permission to do the grief work, which is, they often are feeling torn. I had one client she had a very good marriage. And when her husband died, she was overstimulated. She was going out like every other night, and she's 73. It was just too much, but she felt bad saying no to people. We did a whole process of learning how to set boundaries and what is the right amount of social stimulation for her, because she was getting overwhelmed by the social. Yeah. Thank God, luckily for her, she had a lot of friends, and and her family, but it was getting to be too much for her nervous system. So anyway, learning how to moderate the social with the quiet time, it's really not easy. It was very difficult for her.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the other things that we often see is that, especially in men and adolescents and sometimes even small children, what we will see is anger as opposed to the sadness. And so sometimes I think it's really important for us to be aware that how people are presenting may not necessarily be what they're experiencing on the inside. And so I do think it's important, and we'll talk about this more when we talk about techniques and solutions. I do think it's important for us to, at the very least, be aware that how people present on the outside may be very different than what they're experiencing on the inside.
I just wanted to share a quote. And again, pardon me for I'm using my phone instead of paper today.
I know. Look at you go.
I know. Well,
technology girl.
Well, my printer's down. So here we go. But when Joan Didion had a horrible year when she lost her husband and her daughter.
I love that book, A Year of Magical Thinking. It's such a great book.
Yeah, it was a really difficult play. It was playing at the Lyric Stage, and I went to see it. Oh my God, it was so depressing. Anyway, she said, "A single person is missing for you, and the whole world is empty." I just love that, and when you miss that, and when that one person, or the special person, and you feel like there's nothing left. Yeah. And she talked about it a lot in her book, The Magical That Year. But I love that it's not a cognitive distortion, but it is, because life goes on. Yeah,
and you're actually doing a really great job of segueing into our segment about the realities and myths of grief and loss. And you were just talking about the relational piece. And I think some of the things that I have witnessed is that your relationships with other people often change when you've lost someone. Oftentimes people don't know what to say. They don't know how to respond. And so they don't want to do the wrong thing, so they do nothing at all. And then sometimes the most unexpected people that you would never think of reaching out to you do. And it's not that they know how to say the right thing. It's they've had the courage to just reach out. So I'm always struck by that. And then the other relational thing that I'm really struck by, and this is especially true when we lose a person, is we not only lose that person, we lose the relationship that we created with them. So if you think about the relationship you have is almost like this psychological being that you co-created with another human being.
Another entity almost.
Right. So you're not just losing that person, but you're losing that entity, that psychological attachment that was co-created as well. And I guess the other thing that we often don't talk about is we oftentimes lose the part of ourselves that emerged as a result of that relationship.
Interesting.
Right? So I think that when we are often talking about loss, we're often listening to people and trying to help them process multiple layers of loss at the same time, because any loss that you have right now is likely going to trigger all of the old losses that you've ever had.
That's right.
And so there can be this cascading effect, and that's really what can make grief so complicated.
It is. You're reminding me, I don't know, somebody made this up, but have you ever heard this expression, when you're hysterical, it's historical?
That's interesting.
And also with grief, like when one feeling of grief of a loss can trigger all the grief, like a stack attack. Yeah, all the grief emotions that had been repressed suddenly can rise up.
Right.
I remember when I lost my first cat in New York. I'd gone to the gym. I was at New York Sports Club. I was doing my stretching on the mats. Thank God it was late. Nobody was around. And I don't know, something just hit me. I missed my cat so bad, and I started crying hysterically on the mats. And look, I got it out. It was like 10 minutes, but I had to do the grief work, and there was something. And then it wasn't just my cat; it was also some other things going on in my life, and I had a huge grief release. Unplanned, unexpected, but I knew enough. I wasn't a therapist at the time, but I knew enough to say, "Well, it's okay, got it out." It's like a grief bolt,
right?
Like cough it up,
right? Well, and I think part of what you're saying is really important. Is literally anything can trigger a grief reaction.
Oh, no.
A smell, a sound, somebody who reminds you of somebody. An anniversary, like the calendar.
That's huge. Oh, let's talk about that.
Yeah. So there's this thing called anniversary effects, which are over the course of a calendar year. I usually tell my clients to block off 2 weeks before the date and 2 weeks after that date. And if you're starting to feel a little off, what we might be starting to see for you is just an anniversary effect, where just the time of year
real.
in the calendar.
No, it's totally real. I know for sure. Yeah, and it can be the birthday.
Yeah.
It could be the anniversary of the marriage. It could be the day they died.
Yeah.
It could be Christmas or Easter or Hanukkah, any of the special moments.
Yeah.
Or the anniversary of a trip they did. I mean, any of those big things can trigger it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so oftentimes people on a fairly regular, by regular we mean annual basis, times of year that are just harder than others. We often talk about this at the holidays in particular. And for the clients that I work with, we actually start talking about anniversary effects in October, just because for people who might be celebrating the Jewish high holidays in September, they're coming off of those holidays. But then that kind of launches us into those various fall and winter holidays.
I call it the red zone.
The red zone, okay.
Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's.
Well, and Hanukkah. That's right.
And even Valentine's Day.
Right, and Kwanzaa. New Year's.
What is it? Diwali. I mean, all those.
Right.
But from it starts with October 31st. Also for my recovering food medicators. I mean, the sugar people.
Right.
It kicks off with Halloween. It ends
really
Valentine's Day.
Yeah.
Candy's half price at CVS after the Halloween. And we're committing not to go. I mean, there's all kinds of drama for the sugar addicts and the alcoholics too, and the shoppers.
Right.
So it's a red zone. It's a happy time of year. It's also very stressful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually once read a study that said the highest suicide rates of the year in our country were Christmas, New Year's week, and July 4th, Independence weekend. Do you know more than that? Is there more?
Yeah. So some of those studies are a little on the outdated side. So I think one of the things that I think is just really important to emphasize is suicide can happen anytime. So we should be vigilant all the time. And this is September, so it's Suicide Awareness Month. So this is a time for us to be specifically more aware about kind of suicidality around this time of year. But just to reiterate that it's important to stay vigilant about suicide all year around. So interestingly, there aren't, from just a pure statistical standpoint, there aren't as many suicides as we think there are during the holidays. Oftentimes, it's actually the kind of spring and summer is where we oftentimes see more of that.
Well, I think with social media, there's more this compare and despair because it becomes very intense.
Yeah.
When people are like on the beach, having fun, or in France having vacations, and then they're home like watching the kids or a sick mother, and they're depressed.
Yeah. Yeah. We also know, if we're going to just talk about kind of suicide for a moment, we know that Sunday nights
very popular
are just a really hard time. It's the end of the weekend. People are looking forward to like the week of work. So again,
I'm not laughing. I'm just the absurdity of our lives. I mean, how people get so wound up. I mean, I'm laughing at the absurdity. That take something so seriously that you'd kill yourself over a job or not having a job,
Well, and it's also, I think, important to remember that it's not just a job for some people. It's like a source of identity, right?
I know.
And so it's important for us to stay mindful of that. I'm wondering some other realities or myths related to suicide that feel important.
The myths of suicide.
Yeah. So just as an example of one, just to kick the conversation off, there is this cultural myth that the first year of grief is the hardest, which is total crap. First of all, there's no scientific data to support that. And secondly, from just a pure psychological standpoint, that first year for most people is such a blur, and your defenses are up. You're in shock for that first year that, at least in my experience, it's the subsequent year. It's year 2, 3, and 4 that now you actually know the person is not coming back or the pet is not coming back.
Yeah.
So I do think that we often tell people these myths about, it'll get better in a year. And it often doesn't get better.
That's a very good point.
In a year.
And to have compassion for yourself, to be able to say, it's okay. I'm doing the best I can. I really get upset when families tell someone, like, you're such a drama queen, let it go, get over it already.
Yeah.
It's time to move on. It's over 6 months. They say if it's after 6 months, it's not normal. And where'd they get that from?
Yeah, I have no idea where they got that
That's out
from.
there. People think it's
Yes,
a 6 month deadline.
Yes.
So I say to them, no. I said, and I tell, this is my expression. I really believe this. I make this up part of it. Every time you share your grief, you cut it in half. And you share it again with a therapist, with a minister, with a rabbi. You cut it in half. And eventually, it's this little sliver. It never goes away. And it can be very bittersweet or very tender. But it's better. But it's still there. There's an illusion if it's never going to go away, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And that's there's actually a quote I wanted to share about this idea that when you share your grief, you cut it in half. It's from an old book, The Memoirs of a Geisha by Arthur Golden. Did you ever read that book? Oh, it was a gorgeous book. Anyway, he talks about, this is the grief. It's what the Japanese call the onion life, peeling away a layer at a time and crying all the while. And then there's another part where he says, grief is the most peculiar thing. We're so helpless in the face of it. It's like a window that won't simply open of its own accord. The room grows cold and we can do nothing but shiver. But it opens a little less each time and a little less. And one day we wonder, what has become of it?
Yeah.
And I just love that. It means the hope of it gets better.
Yeah. Yeah. And, again, I think the other thing that feels important to me as I think about grief is that the reason why people may grieve differently, even over the same person or the same pet, is that people have different relationships and attachments to different people. And one of the things that I've learned is that oftentimes the quality or the intensity of the attachment that people have to the person, place, pet, or thing that was lost corresponds to the kind of grief, the intensity of the grief that they often have. And I think that really gets us into our conversation about ambiguous loss, and disenfranchised grief.
Yes.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about ambiguous grief?
Well, ambiguous grief or ambiguous loss is when someone is here but they're not here. So by definition, the person could be lost at sea.
Yeah.
The person could be out in the woods hiking, eaten by a bear, maybe or never found. The person could be an alcoholic, a drug addict, whatever, some kind of addictions running them. So they're here, but they're not their normal selves.
Yeah.
They could have Alzheimer's or cancer, and they're debilitated from their illness. So they're here, but they're like not themselves.
Right.
And also a person after a stroke. When someone has a stroke or a seizure or a hypertensive emergency, they're here, but they're altered and they're not the same.
Yeah.
And maybe they've lost capacity. So their activities of daily living are tremendously diminished.
Right.
So that ambiguous loss is difficult because it's not a formal funeral.
Yeah.
They're still here. They're still carrying on. You're dealing with them. And also, complicated grief also is another distinction. When you have someone in your life who does die and they have, but you have mixed feelings about them, like you love them and you hate them. And so these are areas that are very often difficult to talk about because people don't even know the term or they don't know what's wrong with me. Why am I feeling this way?
Sure.
But I wanted to share a quote concerning complicated and ambiguous grief because Dr. Daniel Amen, who's a psychiatrist, when at his father's funeral, he had a complicated relationship with his father. His father was a tough guy, and he loved him, but he also had trouble with him. And he said in his book, The Brain is Always Listening, his father said, "I don't get heart attacks, I give them." His father was a very difficult man, so this was the kind of person, like, you're grieving the father, but also like good riddance. The man was a bastard,
Sure.
So anyway, he talks about it in his book. And I love that we have to accept the fact sometimes it's not so easy, complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I push back a little bit on our profession about is I think most people who grieve would say that their grief is complicated. Mm-hmm. I know that clinically we make distinctions between complex and complicated grief. And I think those distinctions are helpful amongst professionals. But I think that most of the people I've ever worked with not only believe, but when you hear their story, it's complicated and it's complex. Yes. And so I do think it's important that we acknowledge that those griefs, that there are some griefs that are atypically complicated. But I also think we should just acknowledge that most grief is complicated in some way, shape, or form.
You're absolutely right. And also people need to be validated.
Yeah.
And that's it. The problem with the families, if you guys are listening to this and wondering, don't be hard on someone because they keep crying about their loss. I mean, it's part of the process. And some people cry a lot for years. You can't tell them to stop crying or tell them stop feeling that way. Pull yourself up, buttercup, That's the worst thing you can do to someone who's having grief.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I think the other kind of grief that I think both you and I as professionals are especially vulnerable to is what we call disenfranchised grief.
Yes. Oh.
And disenfranchised grief is a kind of grief where there is no socially or culturally acceptable place for the griever to express that grief. So I think about if a therapist loses a client, mm-hmm. if a medical doctor loses a patient or a nurse loses a patient, our relationship with the person who has died is not typically formally or socially or culturally recognized as a significant relationship, and therefore we shouldn't have a grief reaction to it. However, given what we do and given the stories that we are told and given the intimacy mm-hmm. Of the work that we do, we oftentimes know our clients better than their friends and their family members do. And yet there isn't really a place for us to talk about that. And there's no ritual either.
That's a very good point. And that deserves more attention.
Yeah.
The grieving of a loss of a client, how about when they're successful and they move on?
Yes.
And they graduate, so to speak, they graduate. And that's a very good topic. So we have about another minute to go.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for this wonderful sharing of information. And we're going to continue in the next episode on interventions, tips, techniques, processes that can help a grieving person move through it. Heath has his things, I have my things, and there's like a world out there of tools and techniques. So thank you all for joining us today at Process Recordings. I'm Lisa Wessan, and
I'm Heath Hightower.
Yes, and we'll be back with the next episode with the follow-up on grief part 2. And as I always like to say, good health is wealth. Go for it. You deserve to have fabulous health, mental, physical, spiritual. Be well.
Thanks, everybody. Take care now.
Process Recordings is produced by Lisa Wessan and Heath Hightower, with technical support from Chelmsford TeleMedia, the community media center of Chelmsford, Massachusetts.